Chapter 22. New Acquaintances. The harbour in Belize was teeming with activity as the intrepid group of travellers made their way down to the quayside. They were met with the sight of hundreds of yachts, of all shapes and sizes, busily finishing the last of their preparations for their future voyages. A few of the larger vessels lying at anchor outside of the main harbour were taking on the last of their provisions before they set off on their yearly crossing of the Atlantic for refits, before spending the summer in the Mediterranean. After finding a comfortable spot along the quayside, James and Chris headed off towards the harbour master's office in the hope of finding out if any of the yachts were looking for extra crew to work the passage across, leaving the rest of the group to chill out in the blazing heat of the midday sun. Rachel and Devon spread themselves out on the stone paving and soaked up the rays, whilst Ollie and Gaz checked out some of the stunning semi-naked girls sunning themselves on the decks of the yachts in the marina. "How are your chat-up lines these days?" Gaz jokingly asked Ollie with a cheeky little smile. "Pretty well used. Why?" "Well, I was thinking we may be able to charm our way on board a boat if we find the right mark. You game?" "Dude, that's like asking if the Pope's a Catholic," Ollie replied. The pair sauntered off down to one of the many gangways leading down onto the pontoons of the marina, excited by the prospects that might arise from the shenanigans they were about to get up to. The two of them spent the next hour or so attempting to charm many of the female occupants, but with little success. That was until they caught sight of a tender leaving one of the largest super yachts and heading towards the pontoons at the far side of the marina from where they were currently standing. The tender's lovingly polished deep blue hull matched the colour of the mothership. On board were three of the most captivating girls in their late 20s that Gaz and Ollie had ever laid eyes on. The buxom beauties were definitely dressed to impress, attracting as much attention as possible, scantily clad in tight bikinis from which their cleavages were clearly trying to burst out from the tiny triangles of material struggling to hold back the sacred flesh that lay beneath. Ollie knew instantly that this was it. If they put on their maximum charm factor, they were bound to hit the jackpot. Michael and Louis had spent the last several days researching in various archives around London. So far they had made little progress in finding any useful information on either the Liber Veritatis or the glove. There had been a few vague references, but nothing concrete, and each time they thought they were getting somewhere, it would just turn out to be another dead end in a maze. It had been weeks since they had heard anything from Chris and the others. They had expected a certain lack of communication because of the area in which the group was operating. Nevertheless, it had been weeks since their last contact. Louis had become increasingly concerned that something may have gone terribly wrong, and had therefore taken the decision to make contact with Lieutenant Commander Bradbury, whom Chris had left as a contact in case of emergencies. The Lieutenant Commander had shared Louis's concern and decided to use some satellite time to survey the area of their last known position. After widening the search area several times, he eventually pinpointed their position as they crossed the border into Belize. Much to his surprise, as Chris and James had never mentioned any plans of entering Belize. Correctly assuming that something had forced them to change their plans and that they were most likely making their way to the city of Belize, he arranged for one of his assets to make contact with them and find out what was going on. Josh Palmer had been relaxing on his small balcony overlooking one of the smallest streets in the city of Belize when he had received the call from Lieutenant Commander Bradbury regarding Chris's team. He hadn't really understood why it was so urgent, but if he was asked to do something, he didn't question the motives behind it. He just got on and did the job. Josh had a slim, athletic build, with a slightly unkempt look, due to his wiry ginger beard and scraggy hair that seemed to be untamable. He was ex-infantry, now in the employ of the intelligence services. His stint in the Prince of Wales Division had proved to be an eye-opener to the dangers that existed in the world today. He had displayed that apart from being an excellent marksman, he had the dynamic ability to think outside the box, far beyond the capabilities of even the most battle-hardened veterans. It was the combination of both these abilities that had initially sparked the interest of British intelligence, and it was not long after that they had recruited him. Josh eventually managed to track down Chris and his companions down by the docks, but he didn't introduce himself straight away. Instead, he chose to observe the group's activities for at least 45 minutes before he made contact. Well, at least that was his intention. But clearly his low-key observational skills were not as good as he thought. It didn't take James long to notice that there was a ginger-haired man standing by one of the warehouses near the quayside who didn't quite seem to fit in with his surroundings and appeared to be taking more than a casual interest in James and his friends, not to mention being rather clumsy about trying to be inconspicuous. James wasn't that concerned about the gentleman. James always had this uncanny knack of being able to spot a British intelligence man anywhere. He couldn't really put his finger on why, but there was just something about the way that they carried themselves, a debonair charisma that they seemed to give off that set them apart from the rest. Maybe this was down to the fact that they knew they worked for the best agency in the world, or it could be that that they were all trying to be the next James Bond. Either way, that man definitely didn't pose a threat. James was sure that the man would make contact when he wanted to, and therefore he decided to ignore him and let the stranger make the first move when he was ready. James was a little disappointed that the stranger had been quite so easy to spot. It felt a little like he was letting the side down, but clearly he was still young and probably lacked the necessary field experience, hence why he was in Belize and not in one of the more high-profile countries. Eventually, Josh decided that he had been a fly on the wall for long enough, and he moved away from the shade of the buildings, stepping out into the bright sunlight beating down on the quayside. Although it was late December, the temperature out of the shade was still in the high 30s, not to mention the humidity, which made breathing a less than pleasant necessity. It had rained heavily for the past few days, and now the air was heavy with the moisture that quickly evaporated under the blazing rays of the Caribbean sun. Josh crossed the open ground between the shade of the buildings and the group in a few minutes, casually walking along the concrete pavement as if he were just out for a pleasant stroll to take in the sea view along the edge of the harbour. He headed directly towards James, who he had already decided would be his first point of contact, as the man was the closest match to the description Tom had given him. Even though it was clear that the weeks of trekking through the jungle had taken its toll on the man, it was unmistakably the same person that Tom had described, just not quite so well kept. So preoccupied had Josh been with how he was going to make the initial contact that he hadn't noticed that James had stepped into his path, and he very nearly crashed straight into him. Only at the last second did he look up and stop in his tracks, narrowly avoiding a collision. "You should really take more care with what you are doing. Someone could end up getting hurt if you're not more careful," James said to Josh in a slightly cold and unfriendly tone. Josh realised that James wasn't just referring to the fact that he had almost walked straight into him, but that James had spotted him earlier. and meant that he should make more of an effort to be less obtrusive while on surveillance. "Sorry, I'll try and take more care in future, in order to avoid such things from happening again," Josh replied. "Tom sends his regards, by the way," he added, as he began to weigh up the imposing figure standing in front of him, trying to gauge James's reaction to this snippet of information. However, James wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of showing any emotional reaction towards this piece of information, regardless of how welcome the news was that Tom had sent Josh to help them out. The steely face of James looked Josh straight in the eyes and didn't even flicker an inch. Well, he always did have a way of knowing when his help would be welcome. "What's your name? I'm presuming you already know mine." "Josh, and from Tom's description you must be James," the young man replied, feeling rather intimidated under that penetrating gaze. Tom had mentioned what Chris called James, and now that he was in his presence he understood why. There was a real unnatural coldness to the way James's eyes seemed to cut right through him. It almost sent shivers down his spine, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that his innermost thoughts were somehow being torn from the deepest parts of his mind. Shaking off the awkwardness of the situation, Josh finally got to the meat of his intentions. "I understand that you need to return to the UK as soon as possible." "It would certainly be handy if we could return relatively swiftly, although a certain amount of discreetness in the method may well be required." "I think I've found the perfect solution to your requirements," Josh said, turning his head slightly to look at one of the massive super yachts anchored near the entrance to the inner harbour. "The owner owes me a favour or two, and I know he's on his way back to the UK. The yacht is having a major interior refit in about 3 weeks," he added, returning his gaze back to James. "Sounds perfect. Funny the way fate has of dropping a golden egg just when you need one." "I don't think fate has much to do with it. I believe a man makes his own luck." "Well, we can't all believe in the same things. Anyway, I'd better introduce you to the rest of the group. That is, if I can pry those two away from the bikini babes," James said, pointing out the 2 boys deep in conversation with the girls they had met from the super yacht. "I wouldn't worry about that too much. Those 3 girls are from the boat you're going to be on later. Anyway." "That's all I need. Those 2 are hard enough to keep under control at the best of times, let alone if there are beautiful women involved. They'll be like kids in a sweet shop." "Nothing ever as simple as it could be," James laughed, knowing full well that it was now going to be an interesting voyage back to the UK. "I presume you work for Six? I don't suppose that they are prepared to supply us with a few bits of kit, as we're in need of some supplies since being relieved of most of our gear." "As it happens, my equipment officer Barclay is in the process of putting together a few items for you. We anticipated that you may be in need of a bit of kit that one wouldn't pick up from the local store. Oh, furthermore, I've arranged to meet the owner of the yacht at his hotel, Las Terrazas, on the island of Ambergris Cay, later this evening. So we really should make a move to get you all sorted before we leave for the island." "How are we getting there? Are we flying or catching the water taxi?" James asked, fully aware that he could only access the tiny island by either air or water, as the stretch of water between the island and the mainland was too great an expanse to bridge. "By boat, but we're not taking the water taxi. We'll take my boat. It's much quicker than the water taxi. Plus, you're less likely to get pickpocketed on the ride over to the island." "I know what you mean. 2 scamps tried that trick earlier. I think they learnt their lesson." James showed a brief telling smile as he replied. He loved the relentlessness of this city, but he knew all too well that this was not a forgiving city for travellers. Those colourful characters that you meet on the streets could seem friendly enough, but this city had a darker, more menacing side that had befouled many a tourist in the past. Two such creatures had unwisely tried to hold the group up at knife point earlier in the morning. They had soon learnt a valuable lesson and received lifelong reminders that crime didn't pay. Once all the introductions had been made, and Ollie and Gaz had finally and reluctantly parted company with the Bikini Babes, James had decided not to inform them that they would shortly be reunited. They all piled into a taxi and headed in the direction of Josh's lodgings, away from the downtown district, towards the more developed area of St. George's, where Josh had a modest accommodation, if that was the right description for the flat. MI6 certainly hadn't gone to much expense on acquiring the building. The paint on the walls was desperately in need of repair, as the heat and humidity had taken its toll on the building. But then if you wanted to blend in with your surroundings, it was perfect, and therefore a good base for operations. Not that anything exciting really happened in the area. The United Kingdom had once been a full military presence in Belize, up until 2011, but since then only a few special advisors remained. The main reason being that the border dispute between Belize and Guatemala remained unsettled, and tensions still existed between the two nations. As one would have expected from an equipment officer, Barclay had a slightly geeky look about him, mainly due to the long white lab coat and bizarrely shaped spectacles that were precariously perched on the end of his nose. He was in his element when talking about anything technical, and spoke with great authority and length on certain pieces of equipment. Well, that was until Josh cut him off in mid-flow. Barclay, I'm sure everybody here is perfectly familiar with how a mobile phone works. We are rather pushed for time. Well, yes, but this is no ordinary mobile, Barclay replied, feeling rather put out at having been interrupted. As I was saying, this device not only allows you to make and receive calls, but it can also force pair with other devices, much more effective than setting up wiretaps. And it can also be activated as an emergency locator beacon. And I bet the manual's about 800 pages long, Ollie whispered jokingly to Gaz, who tried really hard not to laugh at the jibe, making a sort of awkward snorting sound as he tried to keep the laughter back. Chris glared at the two, which seemed to have the desired effect, as they both took on the look of two naughty schoolboys waiting outside the headmaster's office, having just been caught flicking powder paint all over the back of the art master's white trousers. Apparently, that was not the kind of emotional reaction that modern art was meant to instill. A good 3/4 of an hour later, Barclay finally finished his lecture on all the bits and pieces they had put together for them, by which point even Josh, who usually loved learning about all the toys as he called them, was beginning to get a little restless, as he was eager to get out onto the water. They bid farewell to Barclay and left the house, taking the short walk down an uneven cobbled street to the water side of the beach at St. George's, where Josh's pride and joy lay at anchor. The boat was a pirogue of Carib design, and in true Caribbean style, Josh stripped off his top, dove into the crystal clear waters and swam out to the boat, deftly hauling himself up on board. After heaving up the anchor and stowing it neatly in a locker, he slowly manoeuvred the boat to the beach to pick up the awaiting passengers. The twin 300 horsepower Mercury engine's roar was almost deafening as the screws bit into the water and the boat shot straight out from the shore before smoothly banking to port, taking up a northerly heading towards their island destination. The deep V shape of the Compass Rose's hull cut easily through the calm waters, leaving a white stripe of confused churning wake behind her as she powered off in pursuit of the horizon, leaving the ever-shrinking mainland as just a distant memory.